What's up, YouTube? I am the MMA spokesman, and today, I'll be ranking retired UFC legends in a tier list from S to D tier. Our criteria will place S-tier fighters as those who revolutionized the sport and achieved long or multiple title reigns, while D-tier legends had less successful UFC runs. So, without further ado, let's jump right in and explore the careers of these incredible fighters. First on my list of legends is Michael Bisping in the A-tier. He is a retired UFC middleweight champion and a Hall of Famer. He is the first British fighter to win a UFC title, which he did by knocking out Luke Rockhold in 2016. He is also known for his trash talk, his resilience, and his courage. He fought for several years with a blind right eye, which he suffered after a head kick from Vitor Belfort in 2013. He is now an actor, a sports analyst, and a commentator. He is not in the S tier because his title run was not very impressive. He only defended his belt once against an aging Dan Henderson, who almost knocked him out twice. He then lost his title to Georges St-Pierre, who was coming off a 4-year layoff and moving up a weight class. He also lost his next fight to Kelvin Gastelum by knockout. He never beat any of the top contenders in his division, such as Robert Whittaker, Yoel Romero, or Jacare Souza. He was a great fighter, but not an elite champion. Next up, in the D tier is Kimbo Slice. Now, of course, his passing is nothing to be mocked, but his professional fighting career is fair game. He was a street fighter who became famous for his viral videos of backyard brawls. He had a brief stint in the UFC after competing in The Ultimate Fighter, where he lost to Roy Nelson in his first fight. He only had 2 official fights in the UFC, winning against Houston Alexander by decision and losing to Matt Mitrione by TKO. He had no gas tank, no ground game, and no technical skills. He was a tough and powerful brawler, but he couldn't hang with the elite fighters in the UFC. He had some of the worst fights in MMA history, such as his snoozefest with Alexander and his disqualification loss to Seth Petrozelli in Elite XC. He died in 2016 from heart failure at the age of 42. In the C tier, we have Serra. He is a former UFC welterweight champion and a Hall of Famer. He is best known for his shocking upset of Georges St-Pierre at UFC 69, where he knocked out the heavily favored champion in the first round. He is also a Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu black belt under Renzo Gracie and a coach of several UFC fighters. He is now a co-host of the UFC Unfiltered podcast and a co-star of Dana White, Looking for a Fight. He is not higher on the list because he lost his title in the rematch with St-Pierre at UFC 83, where he was dominated and finished by TKO. He also had a mediocre record of 11-7 in MMA, with no notable wins besides St-Pierre. He never won more than 2 fights in a row, and he lost to fighters like Karo Parisyan and Dean Thomas. He was a good fighter, but not a great one. His title win was impressive, but not enough to put him in the B tier or above. Next on my list of legends in the B tier is Rashad Evans. He is a former UFC light heavyweight champion and a Hall of Famer. He won the heavyweight division of The Ultimate Fighter 2 and then dropped to light heavyweight, where he became the champion by knocking out Forrest Griffin at UFC 92. He is also a former NCAA Division I wrestler and a black belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu under Rolls Gracie. He is now a desk analyst for the UFC and recently came out of retirement to fight for Eagle FC. Whatever the fuck happened to that anyway? Are they even still operating? Anyway, he is not higher on the list because he lost his title in his first defense to Lyoto Machida at UFC 98, where he was brutally knocked out. He also had several setbacks in his career, losing to fighters like John Jones, obviously, Glover Teixeira, and worst of all, Sam fucking Alvey. He had a record of 28-1 in MMA, with only 7 finishes. He was a great fighter, but not a legendary one. His title win was impressive, but not enough to put him in the A tier or above. I am truly sorry, Rashad, but you cannot lose to Sam Alvey and rank any higher on my list. Next on my list of legends in the A tier is Forrest Griffin. He is the only entry in this tier with no title defenses, but he has a special place in UFC history. He won the light heavyweight belt by beating Rampage Jackson, but he lost it right away to Rashad Evans. However, that's not why he's here. He's here because he was part of the most important fight in UFC history, the one that saved the sport and made it popular. He fought Stephan Bonnar in the finale of The Ultimate Fighter 1, and they put on a war that captivated millions of viewers. Without that fight, there would be no UFC today, and I wouldn't be making this video. So for that alone, he deserves to be in the A-tier. Now it's time for my first S-tier pick, Daniel Cormier. He is a former UFC light heavyweight and heavyweight champion and a Hall of Famer. He is also a former Olympic wrestler and a current commentator for the UFC. He is one of the few fighters to hold titles in two weight classes simultaneously and to defend them both. He has a record of 22 wins, 3 losses, and 1 no contest in MMA, with 10 knockouts and 5 submissions. The only 2 men to ever beat him were Jon Jones, the greatest UFC fighter of all time, and Stipe Miocic, the greatest UFC heavyweight of all time. Despite what you may think of him as an announcer or his biased opinions towards his friends when they fight, he can't be ranked any lower. Can you really sit there and tell me you'd mention Michael Bisping in the same breath as Daniel Cormier when it comes to accomplishments in MMA? DC is a legend of the sport and deserves to be in the S tier of my list. Next in the B tier we have Antonio Rodrigo Nogueira. He is a former interim UFC heavyweight champion and a former Pride heavyweight champion. Nogueira became the first Pride heavyweight champion in 2001 by defeating Heath Herring. He defended his title 3 times, before losing it to Faber Emelianenko in 2003. He had 2 more fights with Faber, but he could not reclaim the title. In 2007, Nogueira joined the UFC and won the interim UFC heavyweight title by submitting Tim Sylvia in 2008. He lost the title to Frank Mir later that year in a brutal knockout. He had a rematch with Mir in 2011, but he was submitted by a Kimura that broke his arm. Nogueira retired in 2015 after losing to Stefan Struve by unanimous decision. He is one of the best heavyweight grapplers of all time and one of the most durable fighters ever. The reason why Nogueira is in the B tier and not higher is because he never won a UFC title outright. Despite his accomplishments outside of the UFC, he could not reach the same level of success in the octagon. Antonio Rodrigo Nogueira is a true icon of MMA and deserves a spot in the B tier. Next in the B tier we have Bas Rutten, a Dutch-American MMA legend. He was a UFC heavyweight champion and a 3-time King of Pancrase world champion, finishing his career on a 22-fight unbeaten streak. He was known for his charisma, his liver shots, and his versatile skills. He also became a successful actor, commentator, and coach. Rutten dominated Pancrase in Japan, where he defeated some of the best fighters of his era. He became the first King of Pancrase in 1994 and defended his title 6 times. He joined the UFC in 1998 and won the heavyweight title against Kevin Randleman by split decision. He never defended his title due to a neck injury that forced him to retire in 1999. Bas Rutten is a true icon of MMA and deserves a spot in the B tier. Next on my list of legends in the C tier is Uriah Faber. He is a former WEC featherweight champion and a UFC bantamweight title challenger. He is also the founder of Team Alpha Male, one of the most successful MMA teams in the world. He has a record of 35-11 in MMA, with 10 knockouts and 17 submissions. He defended his WEC belt 5 times, but he never won a UFC belt in 4 attempts. He is not higher on the list because he never won a UFC belt. He lost to Dominic Cruz twice, Renan Barão twice, and Henry Cejudo once in title fights. He also had several losses in his career, including to Frankie Edgar, Jimmy Rivera, and Petr Yan. He is indeed a legend of the sport, but not legendary enough to rank higher on my list. Sticking with the C tier, we have Donald Cerrone. He is a former UFC lightweight and welterweight title challenger and a UFC Hall of Famer. He is also a former professional kickboxer and boxer. He has a record of 36 wins, 17 losses, and 1 no contest, with 10 knockouts and 17 submissions. He was known and respected by fans for his willingness to fight anyone at any time, but he never won a UFC belt in 4 attempts. He also had several losses in his career, including to Tony Ferguson, Justin Gaethje, Anthony Pettis, and Alex Morono. He is in the C tier because he never won a UFC belt. He lost some of his UFC records to Jim Miller and Charles Oliveira, which is unfortunate. He is a legend of the sport in his own way, but not as legendary as the ones above him on this list. Next on my list of S-tier legends is Khabib Nurmagomedov. He retired undefeated with a record of 29-0 in MMA and 13-0 in the UFC. He dominated some of the best fighters in the lightweight division, such as Conor McGregor, Dustin Poirier, and Justin Gaethje. He also won the BBC Sports Personalities World Sportstar of the Year in 2020. I'm not a fan of his style or personality, but I respect his skills and achievements. He put Dagestan on the map and transcended the sport. He never bled, never got dropped, and barely got hit clean in his career. He is the lowest entry for the S tier on my list, but he deserves to be there nonetheless. Moving on to the D tier, we have Ben Askren. Now, this one might be controversial, because before he joined the UFC, he was a dominant force in other promotions. He was a former Bellator and 1 welterweight champion, with an undefeated record of 18-0 with 1 no contest. He was also a 2008 Olympic wrestler and a 2-time NCAA champion. But this is a list of UFC retired legends, and in the UFC, his run was a fucking joke. He got traded for one of the greatest fighters in UFC history, Demetrius Johnson, but he failed to live up to the hype. He got dropped on his head by Robbie Lawler, flying kneed into the Shadow Realm by Jorge Masvidal, and submitted by Demian Maia. He finished his UFC career with a record of 1 fluke win and 2 dominant losses to contenders who themselves couldn't capture UFC gold either. Not only this, but he also come back out of retirement for a boxing match against YouTube star Jake Paul, which he lost by devastating knockout. This doesn't affect his ranking on my list, but I just enjoy bringing it up. That's why he's in the D tier, because despite his accomplishments elsewhere, in the UFC he was a disappointment. He's a D tier legend next to Kimbo Slice. Next up in the C tier, we have Rory MacDonald. He was a top welterweight who beat BJ Penn, Tyron Woodley, Demian Maia, and Douglas Lima. He fought for the UFC title twice, but lost to Robbie Lawler both times. The second fight was a legendary war that many consider to be the best ever. He retired in 2022 after losing in the PFL. MacDonald was a well-rounded fighter with killer instinct. He had some impressive finishes, but he also took a lot of damage. He left the UFC in 2016 and won the Bellator title in 2018, but lost it in 2019. He never reached the top of the UFC mountain. MacDonald was a great fighter, but he never reached his full potential. That's why he's in the C tier. Next in the A tier, we have Robbie Lawler. He retired 2 weeks ago after knocking out Nico Price in the first round. He was a ruthless fighter who always brought the violence. He had some of the most exciting knockouts and epic wars in UFC history. He was a former UFC welterweight champion who defended his belt twice. He beat Johnny Hendricks and Rory MacDonald in classic fights, but lost it to Tyron Woodley. He then went on a losing streak, but ended his career with a sensational knockout. He was one of the most beloved fighters in the sport and one of the greatest welterweights of all time. I wanted to place him in the S tier based on his career longevity, classic fights, and title run, but he didn't hold 2 belts like DC or dominate every opponent like Khabib, so I have to place him in the A tier. He was an A tier legend. Next in the C tier, we have Diego Sanchez. He was the first winner of The Ultimate Fighter and had some of the most memorable fights in UFC history with Nick Diaz, Karo Parisyan, Clay Guida, and Gilbert Melendez. He fought in 4 weight classes and was a title contender in the lightweight division. He retired in 2022 after losing to Kevin Lee at Eagle FC 46. Sanchez was known for his wild style and his warrior spirit. He had some of the most bloody and exciting battles in UFC history, such as his fight with Martin Kampmann, which he won by decision despite being badly cut and swollen. He also had some of the most bizarre moments in UFC history, such as his pre-fight ritual of yelling yes repeatedly, his post-fight interview where he thanked Jesus for hitting him with a clarity strike, and his disqualification win over Michel Pereira, where he asked the referee if he would win if he couldn't continue due to an illegal knee. Sanchez also had a controversial relationship with his coach and manager, Joshua Fabia, who was widely criticized for his unconventional and dangerous training methods, such as hanging Sanchez upside down and hitting him with bare-knuckle strikes. Fabia also clashed with the UFC officials, commentators, and media, and accused them of trying to smear Sanchez and sabotage his career. Sanchez eventually parted ways with Fabia after being released by the UFC. Sanchez was a fan favorite who always put on a show, but he never reached the top of the UFC mountain. He also tarnished his legacy with his association with Fabia. He was a C-tier legend. Next in the B-tier, we have Luke Rockhold. He was a former UFC middleweight champion who never defended his belt. He ran through the middleweight division and beat Chris Weidman, who had just beaten Anderson Silva, for the title. However, he lost to Michael Bisping in his first title defense in one of the biggest upsets in UFC history. Rockhold was a skilled striker and grappler who had some impressive finishes in his UFC career, such as his armbar over Tim Boetsch, his rear naked choke over Lyoto Machida, and his ground and pound over David Branch. He also moved up to light heavyweight, but was knocked out by Jan Blachowicz. Rockhold retired in 2023 after losing to Paulo Costa at UFC 278. He was a B-tier legend and one of the best middleweights of his era. Next in the S-tier of my legends list is none other than the GOAT himself, Anderson Silva. This legendary fighter redefined what it means to be a UFC champion. With his unparalleled striking precision, Spider showcased mesmerizing performances inside the octagon. His reign as the middleweight champion lasted for a record-breaking 2,457 days. That's nearly 7 years of dominance. Anderson's highlight reel knockouts and fluid movements left opponents and fans in awe. Who could forget his Matrix-like dodges against Forrest Griffin? He is widely regarded as one of the most entertaining and influential fighters in the sport, inspiring many other fighters to emulate his style and attitude. Silva's wins over top-notch fighters like Chael Sonnen and Rich Franklin solidified his status as a true great. He is a UFC Hall of Famer and a true icon of MMA. His legacy, charisma, and unmatched skills make him a bona fide S-tier legend. Next in the B-tier is Dan Henderson, a veteran of the UFC and a former Olympian wrestler. He has competed in 4 weight classes, from welterweight to heavyweight, and has won titles in Pride and Strikeforce. He is known for his powerful right hand, which he calls the H-bomb, and his ability to knock out anyone with one punch. He has 16 knockouts in his MMA career, including some of the most memorable ones in UFC history, such as his flying forearm on Michael Bisping at UFC 100 after landing the H-bomb and his elbow on Hector Lombard at UFC 199. He has also faced some of the best fighters in the world, such as Anderson Silva, Quentin Jackson, Vitor Belfort, Rashad Evans, and Lyoto Machida. He is a UFC Hall of Famer and a legend of the sport. However, he never won a UFC belt, despite challenging for it 4 times. That's why Dan Henderson is a B-tier fighter and deserves to be on this list. Next in the A-tier is BJ Penn, a pioneer and an innovator of the sport and one of the best pound-for-pound fighters in his prime. He was the first non-Brazilian to win the World Jiu-Jitsu Championship at black belt level and the second of 8 fighters in UFC history to win titles in multiple weight classes. He also won the Rumble on the Rock Lightweight Championship in K1 and submitted long-reigning then-champion Matt Hughes to capture the UFC Welterweight Championship. Penn had an impressive run in the UFC, tying Khabib, Frankie Edgar, and Benson Henderson for the most lightweight title defenses. He's also fought at many different weight classes, even a fight with Lyoto Machida early in his career, and he was tiny in comparison. The dude was a machine, and he rightly deserves a spot in the A-tier. The only reason he isn't higher is because he stuck around way too long, and it kind of diminished his legacy when he lost 10 of his last 11 fights in the promotion, retiring with a record of 16 wins, 14 losses, and 2 no contests. He should always be remembered for his prime years, not the harsh decline of his career. Next in the D-tier is Brendan Schaub, a former UFC heavyweight who retired in 2015. Schaub was a finalist on The Ultimate Fighter Season 10, where he lost to Rory Nelson by knockout. He had some decent wins in the UFC, such as knocking out Mirko Cro Cop and outpointing Gabriel Gonzaga and LeVar Johnson. He also had a popular podcast with Brian Callen called The Fighter and the Kid. However, Schaub also had some embarrassing losses in the UFC, such as getting knocked out by Ben Rothwell, Antonio Rodrigo Nogueira, and Travis Brown in his last UFC fight. He was known for his lack of chin, his questionable fight IQ, and his overconfidence. He also had a bitter departure from the UFC, where he claimed he was offered a lowball contract and received a nasty email from Dana White. He is now a fucking god-awful comedian and a podcaster, but he often gets ridiculed by MMA fans for his terrible comedy act and casual takes on fights. Next in the C-tier we have Chael Sonnen, a former UFC title challenger in both the light heavyweight and middleweight divisions. Sonnen was a wrestler who competed at the 2000 Olympic trials and had a successful MMA career that spanned over 2 decades. He was known for his trash talk, wrestling, and pressure. He fought some of the best fighters in the sport, such as Anderson Silva, John Jones, Rashad Evans, and Mauricio Rua. He came close to dethroning Silva at UFC 117, but he was submitted in the 5th round after dominating the fight. He got a rematch at UFC 148, but he was knocked out by Silva in the 2nd round. He also challenged Jones for the light heavyweight title at UFC 159, but he was stopped by Jones in the 1st round. He retired in 2019 after losing to Lyoto Machida at Bellator 222. I know you all have fond memories of Uncle Chael, but when it comes to accomplishments in the sport of MMA, he didn't really have any. Next in the A-tier we have Randy Couture, an American MMA legend and a pioneer of the sport. He is a former UFC heavyweight champion and a former UFC light heavyweight champion. He is one of only 3 men to hold titles in 2 different UFC divisions. He is also the 4th member of the UFC Hall of Fame. Couture started his MMA career in 1997 at the age of 33 after a successful wrestling career. He won the UFC 13 heavyweight tournament in his debut and became the UFC heavyweight champion in his 4th fight. He then moved down to light heavyweight and became the UFC light heavyweight champion by beating Chuck Liddell in 2003. He defended his title against Tito Ortiz in 2004 before losing it again to Liddell in 2005. He returned to heavyweight in 2007 and became the UFC heavyweight champion for the 3rd time by defeating Tim Sylvia. He retired in 2011 after losing to Lyoto Machida. Couture is known for his wrestling skills, his cardio, his game plans, and his longevity. He holds several UFC records, such as the most title reigns, the most title fights, and the oldest fighter to win a UFC title. He is also a successful actor, coach, and commentator. The only reason why Couture is not in the S-tier is because he never had a dominant title run. He lost his title in his 1st or 2nd defense every time he won it. Randy Couture is a true icon of MMA and deserves a spot in the A-tier. And wrapping up part 1 of this legendary tier list in the S-tier is Jose Aldo. Now, I know I've missed some obvious choices, it's by design, as when I was researching this video I found a lot of fighters that won't be able to fit in this current video, so I'll be saving them for part 2. But let's talk about Aldo, who is one of the greatest featherweights of all time, who ruled the division for years and defended his title 7 times. He also had some epic fights with Max Holloway and Frankie Edgar, and a not-so-epic fight with Conor McGregor where he got sparked in 13 seconds, and that's what a lot of casual fans remember him for, which is a shame. However, the dude was still getting better before he retired. It's not like he was declining in my opinion. He was one of the first fighters to lay the blueprint on defending calf kicks, and if he had fought anyone but Merab Dvalishvili, I believe he could have had a shot at the bantamweight belt before he retired. If Alexander Volkanovski hadn't taken that title with his most recent performance, Aldo was the greatest featherweight of all time and for that deserves a coveted spot in the S-tier of this list. He retired in 2022 after losing to Merab Dvalishvili in the most anticlimactic Aldo fight you've ever seen, but he left behind a legacy that will be hard to match. Aldo was a master of Muay Thai, Jiu-Jitsu, and takedown defense. He had amazing speed, power, and accuracy. He was also a fan favorite and a respected champion. He is definitely an S-tier legend in my book. Thank you for watching my retired UFC legends tier list. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to hit that subscribe button and comment down below who you want to see make an appearance in part 2. Once again, I am the MMA spokesman and I will catch you all in the next video.